this series of gaining insight behind a particular subject with someone who works in that specialized field. Today I am joined by Emma Carr, who is the director of Big Brother Watch here in the UK, and we're going to take a look at surveillance and how that information is being used. If any of you guys watching today want to ask Emma or myself any questions, you can do so by commenting on the video feed, tweeting us at Truthloader, or leaving a comment or post on our Facebook Truthloader page. Thanks for coming in today, Emma. So, how much are we being watched?
I think we're being watched every day, and we've got to think about who is watching us. So you've got the state and the government who can be watching us. We've also got private companies now who have far more access to information than certainly the state does. If you think about Facebook, Google, all of the information that we're putting online about ourselves, and they are now obviously obligated to hand that information over to the state as well. So there's a lot of people watching us.
And I know you mentioned Facebook there. I know we were talking beforehand about Facebook Messenger. Apps can gain access to things like our cameras and our text messages, and I mean, how is this allowed?
Well, this is the big question, and something that Big Brother Watch wants to see is to be a lot more transparency around how our information is used and what's gathered, and how it's then used by third parties. So there's so many apps where they can have access to your phone records, to who you've called, to your text messages. They can turn your camera on and off. And a lot of the time these companies say, oh, actually, yes, the app can do that, but we never do that. So we'll say, well, why do it in the first place? Why do we move so far away from privacy by design? And it's just something that too often the companies just can't explain.
What do they get out of having this information?
Well, obviously, information is power, and it's a huge commodity for them. And we've seen that through advertising, and the more information that they can get through that, they can target us with better advertising. That's money for them. We're using these free services. You download a free app, and we have to be aware that it's our information that's being used to make money for those companies. So I think it's just about having some awareness about how our information is being used, but we also need a lot more transparency from companies themselves as well.
And then there's things I read in an article on your website about there's no such thing as free Wi-Fi.
Absolutely, and we're seeing this being rolled out around the country, where if you walk down, say, a high street, and you can log onto the free Wi-Fi, but they're also using that as a tracking device as well. So your mobile phone is essentially becoming a device where they can see what shops you've gone into, how long you've been there for, even down to the aisle, what you've looked at, and then they can target you with promotions. So if you've hovered by the cupcake stand, you might get a 2-for-1 cupcake text message or something like that. And people don't realise that that's going on. And the most interesting thing, I think, around that scheme is that a lot of the time they say, oh, well, if you log onto the free Wi-Fi, this is a fair trade. But actually, if it's just enabled your Wi-Fi and you haven't logged on to use it, they can still track your mobile phone. So you haven't agreed to any of the terms and conditions. You're not using their services. So it is somewhat of a one-sided deal, I think.
So yeah, what we think is a free commodity, they're actually benefiting more from us.
Absolutely, and a lot of people won't mind. They'll want to see those promotions, and they'll actually think if they can see how people are using the high street and use that information to better the high street, then they won't mind. But they just want to be told that actually their mobile phone is being used as a tracking device, and who's going to have access to that information and how that's going to be used.
So what's your view on why we are being watched? I mean, is it a powerhouse by the big companies? Is it you know, why do they want to do it essentially?
Well, you've got the companies who are obviously wanting to use our information to make money. That's what they essentially want to do.
How much money are we talking about?
Oh, billions and billions. I mean, the way that our information is being used over the last kind of 10, 15 years, because of the internet, has absolutely led to a boom. And they've said that our information is the biggest commodity over oil for this generation, and I can totally believe that. But we've also got this situation, so we're handing over all of this information about ourselves to these companies, and these companies are now legally obligated in a lot of countries around the world to hand that information over to the state if it's requested. And you've got people from the CIA or MI5 in this country saying these companies have gathered more information about our citizens than we as spy agencies could ever have hoped to gather. They have done the job for them. And this is why we need to have far more transparency about innocent citizens who are going about their business, who might be commenting on things that the state might not want us to, or they might want more information about what we're interested in or what we're talking about, especially with very topical things at the moment to do with ISIS and what's going on with Syria. Should those companies be able or be obligated to hand over that information and then not tell us that they've had to do that? And I think the companies themselves have found themselves in somewhat of a catch-22 situation where legally they have to do this, but they also are going to lose the trust of their customers who they rely on to hand over their information and make money. So it's a very difficult situation, and something that I think is still going to develop over the next 5-10 years.
So what is the state, or are the states doing to protect the consumer, if anything?
Well, there's certainly more that they could do, and one of the things that we think is that when you log on to any service, whether it be Facebook or if you're doing your shopping online or whatever it is, there should be a very straightforward privacy policy at the top bullet points that says, this is the information we're going to collect on you, this is how we're going to use it, and this is who we may sell it on to or provide. And unfortunately, we've got terms and conditions online which are thousands and thousands of words long. There's some that are longer than Einstein's theory of relativity. There was one that I read, and there was more words than Macbeth. It's just nobody is going to sit down and read that. I've had one privacy policy that got changed recently, and 4 lawyers sat down and they couldn't figure out what it all meant. And it's all because of a lot of these companies are based in the US, they're litigation averse, they want to make sure that they're completely cover themselves in case anyone decides to sue them. But the average person can't decide what that means. They can't make an informed decision about whether they want to hand that information over to them. So in terms of the consumer, that information can be made much simpler. But at the end of the day, for a lot of these companies, they're not going to push for that to happen because it's potentially not in their best interest for that to happen.
Yeah. Okay, then. In terms of the digital age we find ourselves in now, though, how has surveillance become more dominant?
Well, we're just handing over vastly more information than we were before, and we're being required to as well. If we want to sign up to, say, free Wi-Fi, too often you have to put in a full kind of contact page about your date of birth, your address, you know, what you like, what kind of your favorite coffee is, or whatever it is. And too often that information just isn't necessary. They've completely inundated themselves with data, and this is the government as well as companies. They've got so much data that they think that they need because there's this trend in big data. They can't possibly use it all, and that's when you lead to problems in terms of data breaches or data loss. And I think that we need to kind of get back to kind of more simple use of data, only asking what we really, really need the data for.
What about the right to be forgotten online?
Well, I think everybody would agree that sometimes when you put something online, it would be better if we could take it away. I think the recent European judgment on the right to be forgotten was wrong. I think that in this case, they said that Google, as a company, have to take down links if you request them to do so, but the original publisher doesn't. And I somewhat think that if it's legal content, if it's not defamatory, if it's not something like child abuse, then why should Google themselves be the ones to judge about it taken down? Surely it should go to a court, and if it is ruled to be illegal or defamatory or whatever it is, then both the publisher and the other links, so Google and Microsoft or whoever you go to for your search engine, they should have to then take it down as well. Just removing one link from google.co.uk but not google.com and the original source just seems like a very weird way to go about it. I mean, for me, the right to be forgotten is more like, if I want to leave Facebook, then I should be able to leave Facebook. They shouldn't be able to hold on to my profile forever in case I decide to go back.
You can never actually leave
No,
Facebook.
exactly. And that's for me more to be the right forgotten, not the recent European ruling.
And then in terms of the Wikipedia founder, he said he was challenging Google, saying that's why he went out and said, look, I'm going to publish these articles and say that you've asked me to remove these links on Wikipedia. No, and that's why. So I don't think he agreed with it either, does he?
No, absolutely not. And I think a lot of people who are advocates of freedom of expression online see it as a way of people rewriting their past, and that's not what this is supposed to be about. If something is true and something is legal, it shouldn't have to be taken down. I think we need to think about what it means for individual privacy, and thinking about, if I tweet something or if I Facebook post something, that does not go away. That's just the way the internet works. Whether somebody takes away a link or not, it doesn't matter. It is still intrinsically on the internet. And so I think this is a little bit more about people thinking about what they post online, but also having a legal system that understands how the internet works. And so, as I've said, if you want something taken down, you go through a proper legal system, a judge and a jury decide whether it's right for that to be taken down, and then it can be taken down across all things. It's not right for Google to be the ones that makes that decision.
A lecturer told us in college years ago the internet's written in ink, not in pencil, and that's always something that was stuck in my mind that I've always remembered. But do you think that people would deserve a second chance? Just say a 16-year-old did make a mistake. I remember there was one particular guy in Dublin who claimed that he didn't pay a taxi fare, and the taxi man took a picture of him and put that online, and he took it to court saying, I think that was against my, and he took out a super injunction. He said, it's against my rights. You know, I deserve a second chance. Yes, I made a stupid mistake when I was younger, but do you think that's fair? Or
yeah, I think a lot of people would want things to be taken down. I know there's stuff that people have written about me, or potentially I've written about people I've thought in hindsight, oh well, that might not be the most sensible thing to do, and I might not like it there. But we also have to remember that too often for these cases, nobody's actually looking for this information about you, and actually going to court or going through these proceedings draws more attention to the case that you don't want anybody to see. So you have to kind of go through that kind of mindset. But as I said, if a court and a judge and a jury decide that it shouldn't be there anymore, then there's procedures already in place for it to be taken down. I just don't think it should be the companies themselves who have to go through that process and kind of be judge, jury, and executioner.
So is the UK lagging in surveillance transparency in comparison to other countries, or some better than others, or how?
I mean, it's definitely it's definitely not the worst. I mean, you've got to think about some of the countries, obviously in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, which are far worse than we are. But I think as an active democracy and a pretty established democracy, there's things that we could be doing a lot better. And in the US, there's some examples where we could follow. So we don't currently publish or indeed record any statistics on the number of people that we ask for communications data for. So that communications data is everything other than the content of a message. So that would be your email, so who you sent it to, when, how, but not the content of the message. And we should surely record that sort of information. Why? How many people have we done that to, and for what sort of offences? We have very vague statistics at the minute, and I think it's only right to have that kind of transparency around how many times these powers are being used, so members of the public can think about whether it's proportionate or not. And recently there's something called the Interception of Communications Commissioner, who goes into the spy agencies and just makes sure that it's all being run properly. He said that actually these powers are being used far less by the spy agencies and far more by the police, and that's not what you would necessarily expect. You expect it to be for terrorism and really serious crimes, and actually the statistics don't indicate that. So he'd want to see far more information, kind of down to the minute detail of exactly what kind of crimes are these being used for, so the public can make that decision about whether those powers are being used properly, and whether actually when we were sold that these powers were for serious crimes and terrorism offences, whether it's actually being used in that way, and if not, why not?
So when you mentioned terror there, after David Cameron's comments yesterday and all of that, how's that going to change things?
But I think that everybody's obviously very aware of what's going on in the world at the minute, and it can't be downplayed, kind of the threat certainly to the UK. And I've just got back from the US, and you can imagine very concerned about what's going on and the roles that kind of our two countries are going to play in the next few years. And I think we all have to be aware of that, and the government's obviously going to want to do things to make our country as safe as it possibly can be. But we've seen from the last 10 years, when legislation's been created kind of in the heat of the moment, when we've got a threat breathing down our neck, that too often it doesn't work, it's not proportionate. And we've been talking about control orders and about bringing those back. And I believe that, from kind of statistics I've shown, too often those people who are placed under effectively home arrest, they escape. They haven't been charged in a court, they haven't been put in jail, they haven't been extradited, they're kept in their home and they escape. And so that's probably not the best way about dealing with people who are in our country and who pose a direct threat to us. And so I can understand why we would want to bring in new legislation and want to do as much as we possibly can to keep the country safe, but it just needs to be done in a very reasonable and not spur of the moment way. And I think lessons need to be learned from the last 10 years, and there needs to be some more transparency about how successful or unsuccessful prior attempts have been.
Do you think that, I know one of the things yesterday was spy agencies should get, or flight plans beforehand and also flight details and stuff? Do you think this would help combat it, or is that our information being given away again without our pre-approval?
Well, I think all these sorts of things largely go on as it is. I think this is just trying to make it standardised amongst all airlines. And I think what David Cameron said was, if you land in this country and you don't hand over that flight plan, you're going to be sent away and no one's going to be allowed off the plane. And I think a lot of airlines already do that. And obviously, if you fly to the States, you have to hand over lots of information about yourself. If you fly with some airlines in Europe, you have to put your passport number in beforehand and prove who you are and that sort of thing. So all of this is kind of already in place. It's just making sure it's standardising them, giving a better idea of who's coming into the country. And I can understand that. It just needs to be done in a very proportionate and transparent way. And I think we need to also ensure that we don't overstate the threat as well. We need to make sure that this is all proportionate and that the public are aware of what the threat actually means. And I think if you walked around at the moment and said, oh, well, the terror threat is severe, what does that mean? Very few people could probably put that into words. And I know that a lot of the politicians who've been asked about it have failed to put it in the correct terminology. And so we just need to make sure that we kind of keep a level head, I think. We don't panic unnecessarily, but we also make sure that the politicians are doing what they can to keep us safe.
That was my next question. You mentioned terror and threat. Are they scaring people by telling them that the threat's been brought up too severe, do you think, or are they, or do people have a right to know and they should know what's going on?
I think that we definitely need to know. I think that if this independent organisation has deemed the threat to be at that level, then we should know. And we as citizens can't do our bit of being vigilant and keeping ourselves safe. And we do play a big part. We can't rely on the government and on the state as a whole to do that job for us. And too often, I think, in the past, when the government has felt like it's their job to do that, this is when new measures have been brought in that have, every ordinary citizens who are going about their daily business. We've been the ones that have been affected, not people who want to threaten our country or other countries. And so we just need to make sure that we keep a level head, I think, that we are vigilant. And information is power, but we need to ensure that it's done in a proportionate and kind of level-headed way. And I think too often as well, having gotten back from the United States, you recognise in this country we do have pretty much a level head. We don't talk about it constantly on the news. We talk about it in a kind of a moderate way, and I think that's right. I think, and I wouldn't want there to be a situation where the government wasn't telling us things when actually we should be knowing what's going on.
So would you say the US has the most or best surveillance in the world, or what country would you say?
Well, I think the US and the UK probably have the most advanced surveillance in the world, and it depends what we mean by surveillance. Obviously, you've got countries like China and North Korea who have their citizens under far more surveillance, and it's more active surveillance as well. So I've got friends who studied in China, and they said, if I was Googling things for a university project, they would actively stop you looking at something, and a notice would come up saying, this, the Chinese state deems this not to be appropriate for you to look at. Do not try and look at it again, essentially. You've got people monitoring that in real time. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen really in this country, and people are stopped from writing things for newspapers. This sort of conversation that we're having now would be monitored. People can't run for a lot of kind of, in a democratic sense, how we would recognise it. So the UK and the US definitely have surveillance. We have very advanced surveillance, but it's just about the way that it's being used.
What if someone, I remember for Tiananmen Square, their 25th anniversary, which was, I think it was in April or May, they had, China wouldn't let them Google it because they didn't want people to, amass and have all these things. What happens if they carried on Googling it or trying to find out or dig information? Would China step in with the
I
authorities?
imagine so. I mean, it's not something that I've kind of have to tell with myself, but I imagine that they wouldn't be too happy with you constantly looking for information. And we know people who have challenged these sorts of states, have run them, found up in jail, in house arrest, or they've disappeared completely. So, we definitely don't have that in the West. But the way that somebody put this to me, which I thought was quite good, is that we don't have a surveillance state in this country, but we have all of the tools that would allow it. So we just need to be aware of what tools we're giving the government and giving the politicians and giving the intelligence services, and making sure we have the transparency and the oversight to keep a check on that, and also think about not who has them at the moment, but who might have them in the future. And I know from kind of friends who work in kind of similar line of work to me in Eastern Europe, they find it quite shocking how many like CCTV cameras we have in this country, that there is a somewhat lack of transparency about how things are run in this country compared to theirs, because they've obviously had a very different history to what we've had in the UK, and it hits closer to home to them when you see kind of active surveillance taking place on a day-to-day basis.
What about everyday surveillance, CCTV cameras? I've read somewhere that you're followed by about 700, the average person, CCTV cameras a day in London. I mean, is that true?
I mean, it's very difficult to kind of put a number on it. I mean, I've heard so many kind of different figures, but it could very, very well be true. If you think about the thousands and thousands of cameras that are on our street. But it's not just on our streets anymore. I mean, Big Brother Watch did a project recently about surveillance in schools, and we found that there was twice as many CCTV cameras in schools as there are on the streets, and the local government didn't know, parents didn't know, the Department of Education didn't know. There was 200 schools in England that had CCTV in changing rooms and bathrooms, and no permission had been granted behind that. And so you just have to kind of think, how are children growing up? They're growing up to think that that's perfectly reasonable. The teachers weren't necessarily very happy about it because they thought it wasn't there to protect them, it was there to monitor them in the workplace. And then they've also got biometrics being used in schools as well. So if you try and go and register in the morning, or if you want to buy your lunch, you put your fingerprint down rather than using a cashless card. And until very recently, there was no legislation behind that in terms of giving approval from both the parents and the children. And actually in 2012 we had something called the Protection of Freedoms Act, which said that now every child's parent, one parent has to give written consent, but even if the parent says yes, the child can say no orally, and if they say no, they don't have to take part in the process. And I think that's a really good way of going about things. It's about having to sit down to a child and explain to them, this is what information is going to be gathered, this is how it's going to be stored, and you do have the right to say no. And I think, considering how much information we're being asked to hand over on a day-to-day basis, it shouldn't just be a child saying, oh yes, that's fine, I've been asked by someone of an authoritative figure to hand this over, so it must be in my interest. It's about making them think about data in a different way and realise that they have control over that. And so I was very pleased to kind of see that legislation going through.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't know that either. Especially, was it the principals of the schools who were installing these things and doing it without the without the consent of the Department of Education, or they were just doing it to protect themselves and their teachers?
I think all of that. I mean, they have that. They didn't have to tell the Department for Education, and the Department for Education certainly hadn't asked. And so it was just something that was going on. And I think a lot of new build schools as well, there was kind of this want to kind of move towards all the kind of the best modern technology that could be provided. And you've obviously had developers saying, oh well, we could put this, we could install this system, we can install this system, it's what all the new best schools have. That obviously makes more money for the developers as well. So actually they might not need a system like that in place, but they just see it as kind of being the cool kind of technological thing to do. And so I think we just need to think a little bit more about whether it's actually necessary for them to be there, especially when you've kind of got one camera to every 5 pupils or whatever it is in schools that don't have kind of higher than average antisocial behaviour.
I have a question here. It's probably how long is a piece of string? And someone has said, how many cameras are there in the UK?
So there's an estimated about 7 million. The vast majority of that's private cameras. There's, I would say, about a third of that is probably public cameras. So that's police, local government, schools, central government. So the vast majority are private cameras, and they're incredibly difficult to regulate. I mean, we have very lax regulation around CCTV, I think, anyway, but private cameras are very, very difficult to regulate.
What about police cameras on their person? That's a new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's something that Big Brother Watch, we changed our stance on ever so slightly as more and more police forces started to look at them. And I'm actually going to join the Met Police to spend the day with a body-worn camera over the next couple of weeks to see how they're used and see how the information's stored and things like that. Because I think I've had to go at them too many times.
I'd like to do that with you.
Yeah, they've said come in and have a look at it.
Yeah.
I think that if this is about police accountability, and this is about accountability of police who are in particularly high stress situations, so during protests or if we're talking about armed police and things like that, I think it's absolutely right that we have this kind of extra evidence layer so we can hold them to account. I think there does need to be safeguards, though. I don't think it should be the individual police forces that hold on to the information. So when you they dock the camera. It shouldn't be the police force that holds that footage. It shouldn't be them that accesses it, and it shouldn't be them that kind of evaluates it for the kind of the evidence if somebody makes a complaint. I think that should be completely independent. I also think we need to be very careful about how we store this footage, and too often government's using the cloud, which is stored in the United States. That's largely where the cloud is, the information is stored. It can be hacked into, it can go missing, and it's subject to US law. So if the US government wants access to it, they can largely get access to it. So I think we just need to be very careful and again, very transparent about how this information is being used, and make sure it's not a one-sided thing. And I raised with the police forces as well. Too often you've got police having an arrest, somebody not interviewing wants to record it. Say, this doesn't seem right to me, I'm going to record what's going on, and the police say, no, you can't do that. It's, it's against the Terrorism Act for you to do that. You've got to put your phone away. Completely wrong. Completely wrong. I think it has to work both ways. If they want to record us more and use that for evidence, we should be able to do that as well. And I think all police officers need to be made aware of that.
Could they arrest us then, or are they just?
Well, there has been times when people, they've had their phones confiscated, they've threatened people with arrest because they've said it's illegal for you to do that, and it's not. And everyone needs to know that it's not illegal for you to film a police officer. Obviously, we don't want anybody kind of getting in the middle of an officer trying to do their job. But if you stand back and you want to record a police officer, it's completely fine for you to do that.
Two things I thought of while you were there. The other thing was the helmet. A lot of cyclists are protecting themselves by having a camera now, and also Russians, where I think a lot of Russians do it. You always see those Russian videos coming out where they have a camera in their car when they're driving to protect themselves for insurance in case anyone crashes into them. So this thing is like the police cameras, so it's probably there to protect themselves and others. And the other thing was the cloud. There's been a big development in the last couple of days with a well-known celebrity who's had her photos hacked. I mean, what can be done about this?
I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and I don't think a lot of people, if you ask them how the cloud works, a lot of people wouldn't have any idea. They don't really understand how secure it is. They probably have no idea whose job it is to keep it secure. What company holds the cloud, and what kind of regulations is it subjected to. I think the majority of people in this country wouldn't realise it's held largely in America. And so I think people just need to be more aware of what they're putting on the cloud, and probably what they're putting on mobile devices and on the internet generally, especially when we're talking about kind of nude images and things like that. And I think we need to have much more awareness and kind of personal responsibility for where we're putting our information, and more of an awareness. Those companies aren't going to make it any easier for us to find that information. They're not going to kind of actively tell us about how it all works, because, I mean, it's not in their interest to. But I think we as consumers just need to be a little bit more savvy about how we're using the internet, what services we're using, and who actually has control over them.
Can a user disable the cloud if they want to?
Not really, no. It's another situation where once it's there, it's there. And so I think you need to just be aware of how it's being used, and again, what information you're putting on there.
And is there going to be any protect? I know the FBI are looking into. I mean, are they going to protect us? Do they, or how would it be brought across to the UK? I mean, I'm sure that there's probably if it got leaked, it could ruin careers of people. I'm sure,
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that the FBI have gotten involved, because obviously it's because some pretty high-profile celebrities have complained, and I think if it was the average person, then not a huge amount would happen. But hacks take place on the internet on a day-to-day basis. Cyber attack happens on a day-to-day basis. People's credit card details go missing, and this is all about personal responsibility. I think this is the companies themselves. They do what they can. They largely have cybersecurity experts working and trying to keep their companies as secure as possible in terms of encryption and things like that, making sure they can't have access to our passwords and our financial information. But we need to make sure that we keep it as safe as possible as well. So that means changing passwords frequently, not having things like password or your date of birth or your name as your password, making sure you're using kind of devices that have cybersecurity installed on them, so making sure you're not subject to viruses, you're not passing viruses on to other people, you don't click onto links when you're sent an email and you say, oh, this, I don't know who this is, but I'll click the link because it looks interesting. Just don't do it. I think we all very aware of how to keep ourselves safe, how to keep our homes safe and things like that. We need to start being a lot more aware of how to keep our online identity and our online selves safe.
I think the whole point of the cloud, though, was to replace the kind of people leaving their laptops on trains who worked in banks or
Yeah.
you know, in financial services, and then all their details had been stolen, also for ease and convenience and stuff. But what about the hackers? What's going to happen to them, do you think? You know, can they be found? Are they just going to, you know?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they are found, and I think it depends on the sort of crime that we're talking about. I mean, a lot of the time they are found and they're tried in whatever country it is that they're residing, and sometimes they go to jail, and sometimes they're just fined, or they're given an order where they're not allowed to use the internet anymore. I mean, we're always going to have hackers. It's like we're always going to have burglars. And these people quite often do it because they just want to test out just how secure websites actually are. And we've seen people trying to hack into like the CIA website or GCHQ or whatever it is. And then a lot of the time they then send them the information saying, oh, by the way, you should probably realize that you've got a back door and that, you know, I've just walked into your security, and you should probably fix that. So you've got kind of a different range of hackers as well. I think it'd be wrong to kind of stigmatize them all as being kind of out to kind of hurt us. There's just a lot of people out there who, you know, are interested in how the internet works and wanting to take advantage of that. But there are people who are going to want to kind of do it in a malicious way, just as there are people who want to do that to us in our kind of real lives. And so we just need to be aware of that, and the companies certainly are. But I think a lot of people, this is just starting to kind of come into the public domain that this goes on.
I think that Microsoft and other companies actually offer a reward if you can hack in, and then they'll say, okay, we're going to give you money to say, actually, thanks for letting us know that.
Yeah, and I think some of them get hired as well by these companies as well. They say, you know, we've got you know, thousands of people on our staff who hadn't noticed that that's the case. Do you want to come and work for us? And I think, you know, it's an interesting way about going about things, and a lot of people, that is essentially their job. That's what they do in a day-to-day life.
It's like Catch Me If You Can.
Exactly.
Yeah, you got hired. You mentioned GCHQ there. Someone said that you're taking legal action against GCHQ for they've illegally intruded on the privacy of millions of British and European citizens. Can you tell us a bit more about what's going on with that?
Yeah, so we put in a legal complaint to the European Court of Human Rights, and we're still waiting on that. There's some court cases going on within the United Kingdom at the minute, within the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, that other campaign groups have launched. So they have to take place at the moment. They have to rule either for or against the government, and then our case in Europe will be looked at. And this is kind of all off the back of the Edward Snowden revelations about kind of information sharing and surveillance intelligence sharing between the US and the UK, and how that's been taking place, and whether that's affected ordinary citizens unnecessarily. And that's the big kind of interest for us. It's not about direct surveillance of suspected terrorists or people that are suspected to be working or liaising with suspected terrorists. This is about kind of inadvertently capturing millions and millions of people, ordinary people's communications, and us not being aware of that taking place. And so this is, we'll see what happens. It's going to be a long time, I think, before our case gets to the European Court. But I think in the UK, we often, because the Snowden revelations weren't really talked about in the media, and it didn't really seem like a lot of people hugely cared about what was going on. But I was at a few conferences in Europe over the last few months, and I had people coming to me from Estonia and from Georgia and those sorts of countries saying to us, oh, you know, we're actively watching what's going to happen with these court cases, and you know, this means a huge amount to us, and it sets a massive precedent for the governments in our countries to ensure that this doesn't happen to us, and to ensure that, you know, we can be as free as possible. And you've got to remember that a lot of these people have lived under incredibly subversive governments, and we've as a democratic country, in a leading democratic country, we have to set a precedent, and we can't be too hypocritical really when we're saying to other countries, don't monitor your citizens, don't stop the freedoms of your citizens, especially on freedom of expression and, you know, freedom of the internet and things like that. And yet it seems to be the case that this has been happening in our own country, and we have to be aware that, you know, we have a job to do in terms of setting kind of the moral standard in terms of a democratic government.
You mentioned Edward Snowden there, and obviously Julian Assange, who's here in London in the Ecuadorian embassy. And WikiLeaks. Do you think that that's a good thing? That they were trying to release these documents and prove that, you know, what the American government were trying to conceal and hide. Is that a good thing for society?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between Snowden and Assange. I think there's a difference mainly because Snowden took a lot of documents, but he didn't put them all on just on the internet. He didn't dump them all out for everyone to see. He gave them to a couple of respected papers who had lawyers involved, and who put information out there which they thought was in the public interest, but wouldn't hurt the respective governments or hurt our security. And I know a lot of people would probably disagree with that, but I think that's the big difference between doing it that way and doing what Assange and other people have done, of just putting all of the documents for everyone to see on the internet. So there's different ways of whistleblowing, but I think with a lot of these cases, and with mostly all of the whistleblowing that we've seen in recent times, it was inevitably going to happen. There were things going on between the government and the public where somebody or a group of people obviously felt that the government were not being honest with the general public. We weren't getting the full story. We were being told untruths, let's call them, and it wasn't right. We were being led down kind of the garden path in terms of creating new legislation where it wasn't needed, or when these things were already happening and they were just trying to create legitimacy around that. And so in all these occasions, I think it was inevitable that it was going to happen. And I think we need to have much stronger laws around whistleblowing to make it easier for people to come forward with information and say, well, I don't think this is right, I don't think this is honest and what we should expect from a democratic country, but then they should, not have to go and relocate to Russia and have their passport taken off them, so they have to stay there or go and stay in an Ecuadorian embassy. And I think we just need, whether it's cleaners in the NHS who have seen things or heard things and they don't think it's right, all the way up to people who take documents from a spy agency. I think there needs to be much stronger kind of protections around that. And then
slightly going back to as well, how can the government and clouds and all these things, what if their information surely could be hacked as well? Or do they, where is their information stored, especially the UK government? I know you said it's mainly in the US, is it? Or do they keep the government would keep their...
Well, so we're doing some research into this at the moment, and so we're asking local governments and central government, where do you hold our information? And at the minute, it seems to be in lots and lots of different places, in terms of different forms of the cloud and where that cloud is held. So 9 times out of 10, I think the cloud in itself is held within the United States, and as I said, it's subject to US regulation. If they want to have access to it, they can probably get access to it. And so I think that the government as well needs to be very clear with the public about what security is put in place. And I'm sure that they put in far wider security and encryption and things around it than the average person just putting up a Word document and sharing it with their colleagues or their friends would. And so we just need a bit more information, I think, about if that's what the government's decided to do, and if this is the best way for them working, just how safe is our information. And this is everything from kind of our NI numbers to benefits and our tax records and all that sort of thing. So I think the public will want to know just how safe that actually is.
Okay, and something you also mentioned earlier was about freedom of expression, social media.
Yeah.
Can we say what we want on social media anymore? Or no? Essentially no.
No, I mean, and this is something that we've been looking at as well. I mean, I think most people have recognised over the last few years that there's been cases of people saying some really stupid things, and sometimes some pretty awful things. People that society at large would recognise isn't funny, it is quite offensive. But instead of people just taking offence at it and saying to somebody, you're an idiot, that's not an acceptable thing to say, it's not very nice, get off Twitter. People are complaining to the police, and we've got 19-year-olds who are held in a prison for 9 hours because the police can't work out what law it is that they've actually broken, but you've got 300 people who've rang them saying that they're offended by something. And so we've got this situation where people are gaining criminal records for saying really silly things online, and it's something that I think that we need to have much clearer laws around what is and isn't acceptable for something to be said online or to be posted online. You can be offensive, and the law says you can be offensive, but unfortunately too often I think it's taken it goes out of control, and prosecutions happen when they shouldn't, and people's lives are ruined. But we also have to have some personal responsibility. I mean, there's been times where I sat and typed something and then I've thought, it's just not worth putting this online, it's not worth the aggro, and then just deleted it. And I think people need to recognise that in the spur of the moment, people, saying something online is completely different to me saying something to you in a pub, mainly because thousands and thousands of people potentially can see it. Just because you only have 10 followers on Twitter doesn't mean that when it's retweeted, a lot of people are going to see it. And you just have to have that kind of personal responsibility around that. But also the police and the Crown Prosecution Service also need to be a little bit more sensible, I think, around who they actually go after in terms of either a tangible threat being posted online or just somebody being silly and making a flippant remark.
Is it still a grey area then? Because in terms of if you and I said something here defamatory, we would have the broadcast, authorities after us. Do we need a new state body like that to be set up just for social media alone? Is that something that could be done?
I mean, there's the potential for that, but how that would actually go about being policed because of the amount of information that's being put on there, I think it would be very difficult. And we have laws in place that say, basically what isn't acceptable. But those laws were created for the traditional communications, not internet communications. So I think they just need to be updated to make allowances for the kind of audience and the mass audience that social media allows for, but also the rate that people can tweet or Facebook or whatever it is and how they're communicating. A lot of the laws that were in place were created for things like poison pen letters, and so that's obviously completely different from somebody writing something silly on Twitter. So I think it just needs to be updated to make sure that there is no grey area, and that's what we have at the moment.
Yeah, I think we do. Something else that I had written down here. I read there was cameras in Ealing in West London that if you put out your pin on the wrong day, they can fine you.
Yeah.
This is madness.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things like that going on. I mean, there was quite an entertaining picture put on YouTube of it was basically a lamppost that had a CCTV camera on it, and people were out throwing snowballs, and this kind of RoboCop kind of voice came over saying, stop doing that. This is, police will come. And you need to go back inside, and these kids are just like, what on earth's going on? So I mean, all of these things are in place. And actually, when somebody put in a complaint about that lamppost camera, the council said, oh, we didn't realise that it was actually turned on. The voice alert is a part of the camera, but we rebooted the camera recently and forgot to turn that bit off. That shouldn't be on. It should just be a CCTV camera. So, why buy the camera with the? I didn't even think those things existed. Exactly. It's probably from the US because they love that sort of thing out there. But yeah, all of these things exist, and I think that a lot of people when that happens to them directly, they realise that there is somewhat of a surveillance state taking place there, and actually, it's not necessarily proportionate for it to be there at all.
It's madness, the technology, that it knows what it's doing, because it could be just someone walking past, because I know I've seen a video online, it's some guy was spray painting a wall, and a camera just starts talking to him going, we're watching you, we're filming you, and then you stop spray painting and run away. It's just it's just the technology. You also had a study last year that showed 300 councils had sold on information to nearly 3,000 companies and individuals over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And then, obviously, it went on to say that there was 28 billion names, and then this is why this junk mail has started, and it's for as little as £1.50 for 1,000 entries.
Yeah. So there's two types of register that councils have to produce. There's the full register, so anyone who registers to vote will be on the full register, and that's used for electoral purposes. But there's also the edited register. So if you don't opt out of the edited register, you'll find your name and address on there, and that can be bought by anybody, any form of company or marketing kind of company. They can buy that, and that's how you get junk mail. Councils have to do that. They don't have the option. They don't have the option to make it an opt-in system rather than an opt-out system, and that's something that I would definitely advocate, because the councils seem to have different systems. Whether you have to if I register to vote every time an election comes around, I then have to opt out of the edited register, so my details aren't out there. Whereas other councils, they just leave you opted out for the entire time unless you ring them and say otherwise. And there's been a number of instances recently where the councils have gotten mixed up. So the people who opted out who ended up on and opted in, and so I think it just creates a lot more trouble than it's actually worth. The councils don't make that huge amount of money really when it comes to the amount of data that's being sold. I mean, I think compared to how much private companies value data, they massively undervalue our information, and that's not something that's particularly great. But I just think we should get rid of the edited register altogether. People don't want junk mail. They don't want personal mail from pizza restaurants and that sort of thing. It's completely unnecessary. And if they decide that they can't get rid of it altogether, then it should absolutely be opt-in.
And what about the I know myself, I get phone calls from companies who ring, and I have no idea where they got their number. Like, I only moved here a year ago, and I've only given it to my family and friends, and all of these companies are ringing me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we talked about earlier, when you're signing up to, say, whatever it is, free Wi-Fi, or if I want to, promotional deal online, or whatever it is, you've got to fill out these absolutely huge forms, and you've got to put in all of your information, all of your email address and phone number and all that sort of thing. And this is how these companies get hold of that information, because it's sold on to third parties. I did a program recently where charities were using telephone marketers to contact people who've already signed up for that charity, saying, would you like to give more money to this charity, or we're ringing you to tell you about how your money is being used. But what those charities didn't realise is that those fundraising companies were working on behalf of 40, 50 other charities, and they were using your number that you signed up for one charity, they were using them for all those other charities as well. So you weren't just getting one phone call from your first charity, you're getting them from all the other charities as well.
And that's just, up for that.
Exactly, and that's just not an acceptable thing to do. And I think that, I said then, those charities, that doesn't represent the kind of those charities themselves, and they were very upset that that was happening, and that people were getting multiple phone calls. That's not what they wanted, because it makes you so much less incentivized to give money in the first place. And there was also a story recently where telephone marketers were buying information of what they deemed to be vulnerable people because they were easier to get money out of, and that was a direct quote. And I just think that's an awful thing as well, where they were buying information from, say, occupational health, or if you've signed up to a certain kind of health website or whatever, they could tell that that person had was old or disabled or whatever, and so it'd be easier to get money out of. And I just think that sort of practice must surely be illegal and should be better regulated.
For these elderly people who don't know how to stop it, how can we stop them? Do you contact the Ombudsman? How can we opt out of these things?
So there's the telephone preference service. So you can ring that or write to them and say, I don't want to be basically on any open list when it comes to my telephone number. So kind of going ex-directory. That doesn't always make it stop. So I would say, if anybody does ring you, ask how they got your details, and say very clear that you don't want to be contacted by them again. That's the kind of the first way, and usually that should be enough. If they don't stop, then you can ring the Information Commissioner's Office, so they deal with data protection regulation. You can contact them, you can contact Ofcom. And if you're still kind of confused about what to do, I would suggest getting in touch with the Citizens Advice Bureau. So they have in-house lawyers, and they can look at kind of what kind of companies are contacting you and what kind of legal protection that you have in those instances.
Yeah, that's great. That's good to know. There's something else I had here. So we spoke about the edited electoral register. You said you opt out of that. This Snoopers Charters Bill, I don't know if it's still relevant, but how was this ever kind of been accepted?
So we had, a couple of years ago, we had something that was nicknamed the Snoopers Charter. Its real name was the Draft Communications Data Bill, and by that point it had come back about 3 or 4 times. It started under the Labour government a number of years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, and it kept coming back under different names, trying to get through Parliament. And again, this time around, the Liberal Democrats just said, no, we're not having this. We're not having kind of giving the government and agencies wider access to people's online information, which is just not an acceptable thing to do. Having said that, a lot of people will have heard about the emergency legislation that went through over the summer, which was nicknamed DRIP Bill, so that's the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Bill. And that was brought in because across Europe we had some legislation which allowed the government to say to private companies, we'll pay you money to hold on to that information for longer than you ordinarily would for business purposes, in case we want to have access to that because of serious crimes and terrorism offences. That legislation was pulled at the beginning of April because it was deemed to be ineffective and completely disproportionate. It was affecting too many completely innocent people around Europe. So between April and the end of July, we didn't have any legislation in place in this country to make companies hold on to that information. I think the government panicked, and within a week they put through that information. I mean, people like myself questioned the process that went through. That ruling at the beginning of April wasn't a surprise. We knew it was going to happen, and we questioned why there was a 3-month gap between that happening and the new legislation, it hadn't been talked about, it wasn't scrutinised. A lot of the committees within Parliament felt like they hadn't seen it properly and couldn't question the wording behind it and the intention behind it. And so I think trying to push emergency legislation, which is complicated, and a lot of people didn't understand it, a lot of MPs didn't, openly said, we're not internet savvy, we're not digital savvy, this is not an easy piece of legislation to understand, we don't know what we're agreeing to here. But that got passed. The good thing about it is that it has something called a sunset clause, which means that it effectively comes to an end in December 2016. So hopefully within this period, it'll give us time to look at that legislation, potentially rewrite parts, add in parts, and create a new piece of legislation in 2016. But a lot of people did call it a snoopers charter by the back door, but I don't think it's quite as bad as that. But I think the process behind it was a hugely missed opportunity to be a lot more open with members of the public about what the internet legislation means for them, how our communications are being accessed, not only by these companies and stored by these companies, but by the government, and why. And they were very generic in terms of talking about general terrorism and general serious crime. And I think people are now starting to wonder, how is looking at our Facebook messages or our Facebook conversations, how does that actually stopping terrorism? And that's very rarely explained to us, and I think that is actually a missed opportunity, and it's something that the Home Office and members of Parliament could do a lot better, and I think we deserve that as members of the public.
Do you think perhaps they are looking back at the London riots and how that was handled through BlackBerry Messenger and to stop the prevention? Maybe that's their reasoning why.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there's times when the police are obviously going to need access to more information. And it completely took them by surprise, and they realised that actually when it comes down to needing immediate access to information, it can be difficult. But this is why during the debate around the Snoopers Charter, Bernard Hogan-Howe, in charge of the Met Police Service, said that actually I would probably spend the £2 billion which was being earmarked for that legislation on better training and access to the information that we already have. We already have access to a lot of information, but we don't have enough police officers to gain access to it, or the understanding to be able to use it properly. It's not the access to information that's the problem. And I think that was the big thing that we saw with the London riots. It just the rate of it just took them by surprise. They didn't have the staff that were trained to be able to have access to that information. And I think lessons could and probably should have been learned from that. But we've heard so many times from people, the government can have access to all of this information. They've requested from the companies. 9 times out of 10, the companies say, yep, that's absolutely fine, we'll give it to you. We realise this is a serious threat, whether to somebody's kind of individual well-being or to the country. Usually when they don't hand it over, it's because the form's been filled out incorrectly, or because they just want too much information. It's too broad, it's not directed enough. And so I think this kind of, untruth, I would say, about not being able to have access to information it's incorrect, and I think that the government needs to be far more open about what methods are already in place to get access.
Okay, thank you. And then there was something else I wrote down about revenge porn.
Yeah,
it's a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell me a bit about it? Or
so I mean, this is something that's been talked about over the last few months, and I can completely understand why. I think when it happens to anybody, no matter what age you are, it really affects you as a person, and it doesn't matter what gender you are either. It's an awful thing to happen. It'll make you feel absolutely horrific. And this goes down to personal responsibility, thinking about what images you're taking of yourself, who you're sending them to, and what devices you're putting that on. Because this isn't just about me sending a picture to my boyfriend and then him putting it on the internet. Phones can get hacked into, phones can get lost, and a lot of the time videos and pictures are being put on the internet in that way. But also we have legislation in place to make it a crime. There's the Harassment Act, the Sexual Offences Act, Malicious Communications Act. So this is about making sure that the police recognise it as a crime, see it as being something quite serious, and making sure that when complaints are made, that they handle it correctly. I think creating legislation specifically around revenge porn, because it is incredibly complex as a theme, I think that it's very difficult to do, and it'd probably be done quite badly. So we just need to make sure that the legislation that's in place is being used.
Okay, and I've got one more thing, and then we have some listeners' questions,
okay.
if that's okay with you. Traffic enforcement councils and agents work with these. How likely are you likely to win if you challenge them? They make it impossible. If you get parking fines and all that kind of stuff, they put you through all. I know some people who've had a lot of trouble with them. Are you
It is very difficult. I think one of the positives that over the last few months is that the Department for Communities and Local Government have made it pretty much illegal for councils to use spy cars. So these are the cars that drove around with a CCTV camera on top of them, which were just taking pictures. So even if you stopped for 5 seconds to let somebody jump out of a car, you would get a fine. There was absolutely kind of no proportionality to it. There was no kind of reasonable judgment that potentially a traffic warden could make, although I think a lot of people would probably question that as well. But there was no human element to that, to say, oh, actually that person has stopped, say, in a box junction for a couple of seconds because it was the safest thing for them to do. But we're still gonna fine them. So I think that was a win. But I think that we just need to be more savvy as consumers about how to challenge things and to actually challenge them. I think quite a lot of the time people get these fines and they just think, oh, it's easier and cheaper for me to pay it now. And actually, a huge proportion, when you go up to the ombudsman, a huge proportion of parking tickets are thrown out by the time you get to that. So I'd say always question. And challenge, unless you know that I have parked on double yellow lines for 5 hours and I deserve it. You've got to use some, be reasonable about it. But if you think that something's amiss, then always challenge it.
Okay, thanks. Got some listeners' questions. I think the first one I got earlier was, why don't you just put the most embarrassing video and stuff about you online? And then you have nothing to hide. This was someone said. They said, "What's your reaction?"
Well, get it all out.
You just get it all out,
That's definitely one way of doing it. I mean, I don't know if I would personally do it, but I mean, but there's always, but I mean, if you do that, then there's only up from there. So exactly. There could only be even more embarrassing things that could put on there in the future. So yeah, I mean, if that's what they want to go into doing, yeah, exactly.
Maybe that's the answer. Next one from Richard. He says, how scared should we be about misinformation on social media?
What does he mean by misinformation?
What does he mean by misinformation, do we know? The way you use social media.
So people putting wrong information about you and things like that. I mean, it's very difficult, and a lot of social media companies have things in place when you can report things that images that you don't think should be on social media, information that's been put on there about you that is wrong and is actually defamatory or whatever. They have processes in place. I've got friends that work in a lot of these companies, and there is obviously a system where things to do with, say, like child abuse or paedophilia or whatever, that goes right to the top. Terrorism goes right to the top. Things where you say, oh, that person's written a comment about me and I don't really like it, that's at the bottom. But it will all get seen to. Okay. So always make a complaint. They will look at it, but make a judgment call about what you're complaining to these companies about, because they have they're monitoring the entire world in terms of the communications and the complaints that are made. So be sensible about it.
Okay, thank you. This one's from Brandon. He says, companies like NSA and GCHQ, but who watches the watchers?
Me.
Yeah. Big Brother watches us.
That's my job. Yeah. I mean, we try our best, and there's a bunch of commissioners who are supposed to watch them as well and to question them. And there's questions about how well they do that job and how well they can do that job, because a lot of them are part-time, they don't have the resources, they have one part-time member of staff, and these are very big companies doing incredibly technical and complicated things, looking at a lot of information. So we just need to make sure that the government's giving the people who are supposed to be independently watching them the resources to do that. I mean, that's obviously not me. I'm completely separate from the government. I don't think they would give me any money, and I would question their judgment if they did. But I mean, organisations like ourselves are all about just trying to give the public information that isn't ordinarily in the public domain, and the information that we can access is obviously information that we're allowed to access, but there are other people who are supposed to be doing that job for us.
How are you funded then?
So just private donations. So if anyone wants to send us,
yeah.
No, if anybody wants to send us, you know, a couple of pounds in the post, then that's always welcome.
No worries. Okay, we'll say to them. Next, it's quite a long one.
That's fine. No.
Should we be concerned about public discourse being manipulated by altering internet content to promote the interests of the powerful?
I think a lot of people around the world are, and that does happen. I think to varying degrees that happens in this country. There are methods that are in place that the government can say to journalists and you know, news outlets, it's not in the public interest for this to be out there. We request that you don't put it in the public domain because it could actually make things or a situation worse. But I think that happens on a very limited scale in this country. Some people may think I'm naive in saying that, but I think compared to other countries around the world, we get a pretty good deal when it comes to journalism. Obviously, we've already mentioned China, but there's other countries where they get a very one-sided outlook on the world, and it's exactly what the government wants them to see. And I think this is why it's incredibly important for countries like the UK and the US to be as open and transparent as possible, to promote freedom, not just in rhetoric, but also in our legislation as well, to ensure that when we do turn around to countries like China and say, what you're doing is wrong, the people in your country can see that it's wrong, but they don't have the power to do anything about it, that we can do that, you know, with our heads held high, and that China can't then turn around to us and say, well, you've just put through the snoopers charter, so you don't really have a leg to stand on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we have a couple more if that's all right. Yeah. We were talking about the bills earlier that were mentioned.
Yeah.
How can people find out about the bills, because we don't really know where to find them or hear about them?
Okay, so you can have a look on our website. So that's www.bigbrotherwatch.org.uk. There's information about them on there. And also, if you just kind of want the facts in terms of the breakdown of the legislation, then it'll all be on the government's website. So the best bet is probably to go on the Home Office website, just put it into a search engine, and it'll come up. Type in the name of the legislation, and kind of the facts about what it says will be on there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Nick Hill asked, can't the legislation be changed before December 2016? When we were talking about that earlier. So
I don't believe that it can. So when the legislation went through, in a matter of kind of 3 or 4 days, we tried to get some amendments put onto that. A couple of them we managed to, but not very many. And so I think there was this acceptance that there's going to be a full inquiry into something called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which is kind of the primary surveillance legislation that we have in this country. We're going to look into that and see how well it's working, who's using it, what the powers have meant for our country over the last 10 years. And then we'll use that information to create this new legislation. But with the general election coming up fairly soon, with other things that I know the government has prioritised over the next few months, it seems very unlikely that it will be amended.
Okay, thank you. From Herman, what is the danger of vigilante hackers? Can intelligence agencies be infiltrated by criminals?
Well, I'd like to hope that they have better security than that. I mean, it's always a threat, and I mean, there's obviously organisations out there where hackers do get together and try and campaign essentially online through hacking. They see something as being unjust, and they go about doing that. And we've seen before that political parties have been hacked into, and the lists of their members have been leaked online. I know that happened to the BNP and things like that. So it is a big concern, and I know a lot of central government departments and a lot of the intelligence agencies are very aware that it takes place. So, I mean, as I've said, it's just as much as a worry offline as it is online. We've got people in our real world who sometimes want to do harm. You've got gangs, you've got people, you've got organised criminals, you've got people who might just burgle your home, and it's exactly the same online. We just need to make sure that we put as much attention and thought into making our online cells as secure as possible as we do offline.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure if they've anyone. Two more, if that's all right with you.
Fine.
Yeah, Hero of here says, how much easier is it these days to procure someone's private information?
I think it'd probably be pretty easy. I mean, it's not something I've gone searching for myself, but I think you can go online and fairly easily buy lists of people and their information that's been gathered for marketing purposes.
Including individuals?
Yeah,
yeah,
including individuals.
Yeah, I mean, you can find anyone these days. I mean, 30 years ago. I think one last question, do we? From Brandon. He sent 3 questions. So thanks, Brandon. How can the average person combat the growing surveillance state?
I think firstly being aware of what information you're putting online about yourself and what you're sharing and who you're sharing it with. So trying to be as educated as possible about the companies that you're handing the information over to, what obligations they have about handing information over to the state.
Okay, I think that's it, is it? Okay, then, thank you very much. Many thanks to Emma for joining us today. We have another live interview today, later, at 4 p.m. British time with the artist taxi driver, Chunky Mark. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. See you later.